Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, give a like, and don't forget to leave a comment. Enjoy watching.
It started on a Thursday night, right in the thick of the ER chaos, buzzers going off, code yellows barking from overhead, and someone yelling about needing a crash cart in room 7. I was leaning over a tray, scanning meds, double-checking dosages like I always did. 20 years in trauma nursing trains that into you like a reflex. You don't skip steps. You don't assume. And above all, you don't blindly follow orders when your gut screams something's off. That's when Dr. Nolan sauntered in, fresh haircut, Rolex peeking from his lab coat, probably still high off some podcast that told him leaders shouldn't listen to negative energy. He was young, slick, Harvard-trained if you believe the rumors, and dead set on making a name for himself. The kind of guy who called meetings huddles and mistakes growth pivots. You know the type. We were working up a 58-year-old guy who came in with severe hypertension and an elevated creatinine level, meaning his kidneys were already waving a red flag. Nolan orders a double dose of labetalol, higher than what we'd usually push in a guy with already sketchy renal numbers. I blinked at the order, checked the chart again, and asked him, careful and polite, "Hey doc, you sure about the dosage on that? Kidneys are struggling. This could tank his pressure real fast." That's when it happened. He didn't just brush me off. He looked around, made sure a couple of residents and 2 techs were close enough to hear, and said it loud and clear. "You're just a nurse, not a doctor." Then he turned his back like I was dismissed. Just like that. It wasn't the first time I'd been talked down to by someone with more degrees than sense, but something about the way he said it, like I was beneath him, like 2 decades in the trenches didn't matter. Yeah, it hit harder than usual. Not just for me. One of the techs looked up at me with a "damn, you gonna take that" kind of face. But I didn't snap. I didn't argue. I didn't roll my eyes or toss my gloves in the trash dramatically. I did what the policy said. I documented it. I wrote a clear, simple note in the chart. Dose question due to renal function. Dr. Nolan confirmed order. Proceeded as instructed. Signed, dated, timestamped. Then I walked away. Clocked out 2 hours early. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't even take my scrubs off in the locker room. Just walked out into the parking lot with my badge still swinging from my chest and a quiet storm boiling under my ribs. Because here's the thing they don't tell you in orientation videos or staff meetings. You can spend your whole life doing it right, showing up, staying late, holding patients' hands while they die. And the moment someone with a white coat and a God complex decides you're in the way, they'll remind you that you're just a nurse. I sat in my car for 20 minutes before even starting the engine. Just stared at the glow of the ER entrance in my rearview, thinking about how many nights I'd walked through those doors with aching knees and an aching conscience, and how maybe, just maybe, I was finally done giving a damn. Let me ask you something, be honest. What would you do if someone publicly slapped down everything you've worked for, humiliated you in front of your peers, and then acted like you should thank them for the opportunity? Because that's what it felt like. And not just that night. There'd been a build-up. Management had been getting tighter about budgets, cutting overtime, piling on double shifts without asking. They brought in efficiency consultants who'd never held a dying man's hand but sure knew how to cut staff hours. And we all knew what it really meant when they said streamline patient flow. It meant do more with less and don't complain unless you want to be on the next PP. And I was starting to feel it, 2 little things. Being passed over for committee roles I used to lead. Getting my schedule tweaked without notice. Being told I was too direct in patient notes. I thought maybe it was burnout. Maybe I was getting too old for the pace, too cranky for the politics. But now I saw it clearer. I wasn't burning out. I was being pushed out. So I went home that night. Microwaved leftovers I didn't taste and stared at the ceiling while the neighbor's dog barked at the moon. And I made a choice not to fight back in the usual way. Not to argue or storm into HR. No. I was going to play it smart. Quiet. Strategic. Because if they saw me as just a nurse, they had no idea what I was capable of. And as fate would have it, Dr. Nolan was about to learn that the hard way. That patient? The one he doubled the dose on? He didn't make it through the night. But we'll get to that. This isn't just a story about hospital politics. It's about what happens when someone with nothing left to lose decides to stop protecting the people who never protected him. And it starts right here, with a paper trail, a bruised ego, and a slow-burning fire that had been waiting 20 years to ignite. By the time I walked back into the hospital on Saturday night, the place already had that weird silence hanging in the air, the kind that follows bad news or maybe just sits waiting for the next disaster to strike. Nobody said anything when I came in through the side door. No greetings. No head nods. Just a few averted eyes and a suspicious quiet from the nurse's station, as if my name had just been passed around like a bad rumor. And in truth, I could already smell it coming before I clocked in trouble. The kind that wears a polite face but sharpens its knives behind closed office doors. I didn't have to wait long for confirmation. By my first coffee refill, Megan, one of our newer RNs, slipped me a folded piece of paper while pretending to hand me a patient's chart. Inside was a copy of the overnight incident report, typed up, full of vague phrasing and intentionally passive language. It said the patient from Thursday night, the same guy I'd warned Nolan about, had coded in the ICU around 2 in the morning. Hypotensive crisis. Renal failure. They tried everything, but he didn't make it. And guess what the report implied? Medication administration under unclear supervision. Unclear, my ass. I felt the weight of it settle in my gut, heavy and familiar like a bad meal sitting wrong. I knew exactly where this was going. I'd seen it before. When things go south, they don't start asking the doctor tough questions. No, they start digging into the nurse's charting, his tone in the break room, his prior write-ups from 10 years ago about being too assertive during a trauma code. They look for cracks in the armor. Because it's easier to blame someone lower on the food chain than admit the shark at the top has blood on his hands. I didn't wait to be called into HR. I walked right in on my break, sat down across from Jenna, the same HR manager who once cried during Nurses Week and handed out coupons for half-off sandwiches, and asked, as politely as I could manage, "Are we going to have a conversation about Thursday's incident, or am I just waiting to be thrown under the bus?" She blinked a few times, shuffled some papers that didn't need shuffling, and gave me the usual line about ongoing internal review and making no assumptions. But then she pulled out a printed version of my chart note, the one I wrote after Nolan's little humiliation stunt. It was clean, clear, time-stamped, legally bulletproof. I could see the moment it clicked in her eyes. She didn't say it out loud, but the tension in her shoulders dropped like a stone, and her entire tone shifted from clipped professionalism to weary sympathy. She knew I had done my job. More than that, she knew I'd covered myself exactly the way the policy handbook says to, no more, no less. She offered a polite, corporate sanitized thank you for my thorough documentation, and then gently suggested I try to keep communication lines open with physicians going forward. That's HR speak for, you didn't do anything wrong, but please stop pissing off the doctors. I left that meeting without a write-up, without suspension, without any formal black mark on my file. But that didn't mean I was off the hook. The cold shoulder from staff got worse over the next few shifts. Nolan didn't look at me, not even once. He passed me in the hallway like I didn't exist, even though I could practically smell the guilt radiating off of him. And the other nurses? Some of them kept their distance like I was radioactive. A few quietly gave me nods of respect, and one, Danny, who'd been on nights for 12 years, actually whispered, "I saw your note." Smart move, man. But most just stayed silent, like the walls were closing in, and nobody wanted to be caught standing next to the guy about to get crushed. The worst part wasn't the gossip or the glances, it was the emails. Scheduling emails with my name mysteriously dropped from regular shifts. Reminders about continuing education and conflict de-escalation workshops landing in my inbox like subtle threats. They didn't have to say it out loud. The message was clear. I might have dodged the bullet this time, but I'd been marked. Management doesn't forget who makes them uncomfortable. I went home that week more exhausted than usual. Not physically. I'd handled worse patient loads and longer hours without blinking. No, this was something deeper. A kind of soul exhaustion that comes from realizing your loyalty has become a liability. From knowing that the people who smile at you during team huddles will also quietly replace your name on the shift roster and claim it was accidental. I sat on my back porch that night with a drink in one hand and my old college hoodie wrapped around me even though it wasn't cold. I kept thinking about that patient, his name was Richard, and how he looked at me right before I left that night. He'd seemed nervous, scared, even. And I remembered how I'd said, "You're in good hands," even though I didn't believe it. That stung. I didn't make the call to his family. That was Nolan's job. But I wondered what he told them. Probably some polished version of the truth, dressed up in big words and technical phrases that sounded just complicated enough to avoid blame. Doctors are good at that. They get trained in how to talk about failure without ever calling it failure. But me? I wasn't going to forget. I kept the note, made a copy, stored it outside of the hospital system, and I'd started digging into a few other things too, past incident reports, quiet lawsuits, shifts where Nolan's name came up a little too often in situations that couldn't be verified. Because if this was going to be a war, I wasn't showing up with a clipboard and a polite smile. I was going to bring fire. By the end of the following week, the pattern wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a damn blueprint. Clear as day if you knew how to read the signs. I was still clocking in, still doing my job, still answering call buttons and prepping meds with the same steady hands I'd had for 20 years, but everything else around me had shifted just enough to feel off. It's like when you walk into your living room and notice the picture frame's been nudged half an inch. It's not wrong enough to be called broken, but your gut won't let you forget it. I started noticing the small, careful ways they were setting the stage. First, it was the emails. One from the scheduling office saying there had been a mistake with my hours and that they'd be adjusting accordingly, which meant fewer prime shifts and more overnights. Then came the request that I attend a professional development seminar on communication and collaboration, which just so happened to be a 3-hour snooze fest led by someone from corporate who hadn't stepped inside an ER since the Clinton administration. They called it mandatory, but only for a handful of staff, strangely, the same handful who'd either pushed back against poor decisions or had salaries large enough to catch the eye of the budget slashers. But I played along. I sat through the training like a good soldier, even nodded at the right moments while the speaker rattled off buzzwords like empathy synergy and emotional alignment, all while I was making a mental checklist of just how far this game would go. Because that's what it had become, a game, only it wasn't fair, and the people running it didn't care who they crushed as long as the machine kept humming along without friction. And I, apparently, had become friction. The cherry on top came that Friday, right before my shift ended. I was pulled into a quick meeting with Carol, our assistant director of nursing, who used to laugh at my jokes and now stared at me like I'd spilled coffee on her spreadsheet. She slid a piece of paper across the table, an informal performance note, which is HR's way of saying, "We're collecting ammo." It was about my tone with a physician during a recent consult, though no names were attached, and the description sounded more like a horoscope than an incident. Vague, open to interpretation, dangerous in the wrong hands. I didn't sign it. Just read it, folded it neatly, and put it in my bag without saying a word. That's when I knew, really knew, that I wasn't just on thin ice. They were planning the crack. They wanted me to react, to snap, to yell, to give them a reason they could put in a report and use to justify whatever came next. But I wasn't going to play that role. I was going to play mine. Because here's the thing they'd forgotten. I've watched people die. I've been screamed at by grieving families, held pressure on arterial bleeds, done CPR on kids while praying I'd never have to tell their parents it didn't work. You don't live through all that and walk out unchanged. What they saw as burnout was actually restraint. What they mistook for tired eyes was calculation. I wasn't breaking. I was building something they couldn't see until it was too late. So I started my own file, printed copies of emails, recorded exact times when I received policy-violating orders, collected patient outcomes tied to questionable decisions, quietly spoke to a couple of other nurses who, it turned out, had their own stories about Dr. Nolan, missed allergies, ignored vitals, snapped decisions made without listening to anyone but himself. One of them, an ICU nurse named Travis, told me about a case 3 months back where Nolan had pushed a sedative too fast and the patient coded, only to be revived after 10 minutes of chaos. No one had filed a report because Nolan had smoothed it over with admin, and the family never knew. But I remembered that case. I'd floated to ICU that night. I remembered hearing the call over the radio and seeing Nolan walk out 30 minutes later looking like nothing had happened. It wasn't just a hunch anymore. It was a pattern. And patterns like that don't go away on their own. They're protected, hidden, polished over with charm and ego and enough buzzwords to make anyone seem competent to the untrained eye. But I had trained eyes, so I followed the trail. And then, right when I thought I'd hit a wall, the universe tossed me a lifeline wrapped in irony. I was digging through the communal printer one afternoon, one of those big, clunky machines that jams twice a day and never has enough toner, and found a thick packet someone had forgotten to collect. It was a legal document, a settlement agreement, with all the right redactions and all the wrong details. Dr. Nolan's name wasn't on the first page, but 3 pages in, there it was, tied to a closed malpractice claim from 6 months earlier. A quiet payout, patient confidentiality sealed, no admission of wrongdoing. I made a copy and walked away. Because now I had more than a file. I had leverage, and I knew exactly who could use it. There was a patient from 2 years ago, An elderly woman with sepsis who made it through by sheer willpower and the kind of stubbornness that reminded me of my own mother. Her daughter had visited every single day, brought flowers, remembered my name, asked questions, took notes. Turns out, she was a malpractice attorney. We'd stayed loosely in touch, Christmas cards, a thank you note last year. I sent her a message, not with details, just a single line. Think you'd want to hear something? Call me. The system thought it could squeeze me out, but I wasn't going quietly. I wasn't going bitter either. I was going smart. They'd set me up, but they forgot I knew how to build traps, too. I don't know what they expected me to do next. Curl up, transfer out quietly, retire early like some tired old warhorse being let out of the pasture. That's what they usually hope for in situations like this. Make the air uncomfortable enough, stack enough anonymous complaints, whisper just enough poison in the right ears. And most people just disappear. It's cheaper than severance, cleaner than confrontation. But what they didn't understand, what none of them ever seemed to figure out, was that I don't rattle that easy. I've worked trauma nights while understaffed and overcaffeinated, stitched up screaming drunks during holiday weekends, and argued policy with administrators who thought acuity was a brand of paper towels. You want me gone? You better come prepared, because I don't go down without leaving teeth marks. I spent the next week doing what I've always done best, keeping my head low while keeping my ears open. Still showing up, still doing the work, still triple-checking every med, every note, every patient ID band like my job depended on it, because at that point, it probably did. But behind the scenes, the gears were turning. And this time, I wasn't the one getting blindsided. The malpractice lawyer, her name was Stephanie Marks, and she didn't forget things, called me 2 days after I left the voicemail. We didn't talk in depth over the phone. Too risky. Too many unknowns. But she said one thing that stuck with me, clear and sharp like a scalpel. If even half of what you're implying is true, I want in. That was all I needed to hear. I didn't have to convince her. I didn't need to explain why the hospital had been quietly paving over mistakes like they were potholes in a parking lot. She already knew the game. She just needed proof. And thanks to their laziness, I had plenty. I sent her copies of the chart notes I'd saved, the one from the night the patient crashed, time-stamped and clean. I included the copy of the settlement agreement someone had left unguarded on the printer, and a detailed list of all the cases I'd dug up with dates, outcomes, and the staff who were involved. No speculation. No gossip. Just the facts, tight and surgical, the way you're taught to write incident reports when you're trying to survive in a system that cares more about liability than truth. But I didn't stop there. I submitted an anonymous tip to the hospital's internal risk management office, using a burner email, naturally highlighting discrepancies in patient care tied to a single provider. I didn't name names directly. I didn't have to. The dates and case numbers were enough to light a fire. And once the fire started, it spread quickly. You could see it in the way people moved in the hallways that week, quieter, more careful, like someone had pulled the pin out of a grenade but hadn't decided where to throw it yet. Nolan looked rattled, though he did his best to hide it. No more swagger. No more smirking on rounds. He was suddenly polite, suddenly team-oriented, suddenly concerned with collaboration and building bridges. It was pathetic. And then came the meeting. Not mine, his. I overheard it from the break room, through the cracked door of the admin suite while I pretended to dig through the vending machine for pretzels I didn't even want. Raised voices. Words like disciplinary review and precedent and outside inquiry. I didn't need to hear every word to understand what was happening. The hospital, smelling a lawsuit on the horizon, had started pulling up anchor. They were distancing themselves, preparing their statement, getting their fall guy ready. I walked past his office later that shift. His chair was empty. His white coat was gone. Word in the locker room said he was put on administrative leave pending investigation. I didn't celebrate. I didn't even smile. I just logged my notes, double-checked my meds, and finished the damn shift like I always do, professionally. Precisely. Quietly. Because this was never about gloating. This was about accountability. But I wasn't finished yet. The next day, I mailed one more package. No return address. Just a clean manila envelope with hard copies of everything I'd compiled, sent to the state nursing board and copied to the Joint Commission. Not just about Nolan. About the whole damn system. The intimidation. The retaliatory scheduling. The silencing of staff who dared to question unsafe orders. The culture of fear that let one arrogant doctor walk around unchecked while the rest of us cleaned up his messes in the dark. I didn't attach a name. Didn't need to. The facts spoke loud enough. And when I walked into work that weekend, there was a change in the air. Subtle, but real. A few nurses looked me in the eye again. Danny gave me a nod that said more than words ever could. Megan brought me coffee without asking. People knew. Maybe not the details, but enough. Enough to realize someone had finally pushed back. Someone had drawn a line. The hospital would survive, of course. They always do. They bury it in policy changes and training modules, put out a press release filled with legal fog, and pretend like it was just another routine audit. That's the game. But for once, they didn't get to write the ending. I did. And as for Dr. Nolan, I heard he tried to get ahead of a narrative. Tried to say the pressure was too much, that he struggled to balance expectations with workload, that the system let him down. Maybe that's true. Maybe he was under pressure. But pressure doesn't excuse arrogance. It doesn't excuse endangering patients and mocking the people who keep them alive. It sure as hell doesn't excuse treating a 20-year nurse like disposable backup. So now, I wait. Wait to see how far the dominoes fall. Wait to see who else pretends they didn't know. Wait to see if the hospital comes after me next, tries to paint me as the instigator, the disgruntled employee, the bitter old nurse who didn't know when to let go. Let them. Because I've got every note, every timestamp, every policy, and every voice that stayed silent until someone else spoke first. And now? Now they know I'm not just a nurse. I'm the one who lit the match. It didn't feel like a victory when I handed in my resignation, though by all accounts, that's exactly what it was supposed to be, the final, deliberate move in a long game I never wanted to play but refused to lose. The paper was simple, direct, typed neatly and signed in blue ink because I knew someone in HR once told me that blue showed up better on scanned copies. I left it on Carol's desk without a meeting, without an explanation, without fanfare. I knew she'd see it first thing Monday morning, after she'd finished her latte and cleared her inbox of the usual passive-aggressive bulletins from upstairs. There wouldn't be a farewell party. No catered cupcakes. No staff-wide email thanking me for years of dedicated service. Just silence, and that was fine by me. Silence can be louder than applause when you know what to listen for. On my last shift, I walked into the ER like I had every other night for nearly 2 decades, with coffee in one hand and that worn-out canvas bag slung over my shoulder that had been through more shifts than most interns would last in their careers. Nobody knew it was my last night, and I didn't tell them. I just showed up, charted my meds, took my vitals, answered call bells, and stood by bedsides the same way I always had. I didn't want goodbyes, didn't want the awkward looks or the sympathy stares or the half-whispered, "So what are you going to do next?" Conversations that never meant what they sounded like. I passed Nolan's office on the way to grab a dressing kit, and it was still dark. No coat on the back of his chair. No notes on the whiteboard. Just an empty room with a faint stale smell, like the leftover air from a closed-down fairground. I hadn't seen him in over a week, and no one was saying much beyond the usual HR-safe phrases like "under review" or "taking some time." One of the residents said he'd gone home to recenter. Whatever that meant. I didn't care. I wasn't sticking around to watch the hospital pretend they had standards again. Let someone else clean up the mess this time. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself restocking Band-Aids in one of the supply rooms, a task so mundane it felt poetic. That's the thing about endings. They never come with fireworks or orchestral soundtracks. They come with routine. With the beep of a monitor, the smell of antiseptic, the hum of fluorescent lights that flicker just slightly out of sync. And maybe that's how it should be. No drama. Just the quiet dignity of finishing what you started and leaving before someone else tries to write the final chapter for you. A nurse from MedSurg, Elena, I think, stepped in and mentioned she'd heard about everything, though she didn't say what everything meant. I just nodded. She hesitated for a second, like she wanted to ask if it was true, if I'd really brought the whole thing down with a single note and a handful of documents. Instead, she just said, "Thanks for not letting it slide." And that, right there, was more meaningful than any plaque or HR email ever could be. I didn't leave with rage. I didn't walk out flipping birds or giving speeches about how broken the system was, though it sure as hell is broken and anyone paying attention knows it. I left with a calm I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the kind of calm that comes with knowing you still have some power left in your hands, that you didn't let the bastards grind you down to dust and call it policy. Or maybe it was just relief, that I wouldn't have to sit through another engagement survey or mandatory seminar about resilience taught by someone who'd never worked a night shift. As I passed the nurse's station one final time, I slipped a sticky note onto the corner of the fridge where someone had taped up old photos from Christmas potlucks and Halloween scrubs contests. It was just one sentence, written in my messy all-caps handwriting. Don't let them tell you you're just a nurse. No signature. No goodbye. Outside, the sun was just starting to rise, that dull gray light creeping across the hospital parking lot like it always does, indifferent, steady, real. I stood by my car for a minute and watched the ambulances pull in, lights off now, quiet as ghosts. Somewhere inside, a new patient was probably waiting. Somewhere, a new nurse was clocking in, unsure whether they were about to save someone's life or get yelled at over a breakfast tray. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded, like I'd done what I could, said what needed to be said without shouting. And maybe that's the only kind of justice you can really get in places like this, not the kind that fixes everything, but the kind that makes sure the truth doesn't stay buried. Did I go too far? Maybe. Maybe I should have walked away quietly. Maybe I should have left it all alone and let someone else deal with the fallout. But I'd done that before, and it never changed anything. Sometimes you don't speak up because you think it'll work. You speak up because not speaking is killing you a little more every day. So I'll leave it to them now. Let the hospital spin it however they need to. Let the new hires take the training. Let the doctors do their damage control. My part's done. I wasn't just a nurse. I was the last line they didn't expect to cross. And now, I'm gone. 3 weeks after my final shift, I found myself waking up at 7 in the morning without an alarm clock, which felt both wrong and weirdly right at the same time. For years, my body had been so hardwired to hospital rhythms that the absence of buzzers, overhead codes, and those grim fluorescent lights felt like stepping into someone else's life. The silence was eerie at first, almost suspicious, like I'd forgotten to do something or left someone on hold mid-sentence. I kept reaching for my work badge on the dresser each morning before remembering I'd left it in a drawer, next to an old stethoscope and a coffee-stained shift calendar from 2 Decembers ago. I wasn't part of the hospital anymore, but the hospital hadn't quite left me either. I started walking more, which sounds small, but when you've spent years rushing around concrete floors on worn-down soles and stiff knees, walking without a purpose, just for the air, feels like rebellion. I'd head down to the small park near my house where old men played chess and retirees power walked in circles, and I'd sit on the bench with a coffee and a notebook I wasn't even writing in. Just sitting there, feeling my own pulse slow down for the first time in years, trying to remember what it felt like to just exist without being in crisis mode every minute of the day. I got a message from Danny a few days into this new routine, short, cautious, but it carried more weight than he probably meant it to. He's not coming back. HR made it official. You were right to document it. That was it. No names. No details. But I didn't need them. I knew who he meant. And I knew exactly what not coming back meant in hospital speak. It meant that the hospital had done its favorite trick, removed the problem without admitting it ever existed in the first place. Dr. Nolan's office would be cleaned out quietly, his name quietly erased from directories, and some other young doctor would take his place, hopefully one who listened when experienced nurses spoke up. And still, I didn't feel satisfied the way people probably think you should feel when the so-called villain of your story gets shown the door. Because it was never really about one guy in a white coat. It was about a system that made people like him untouchable until someone finally said enough. That system was still running, still chewing up good nurses and spitting them out over tone and attitude and other coded ways of saying you didn't know your place. A week later, I got a handwritten letter from Stephanie Marks, the attorney I'd quietly tipped off. She didn't give details lawyers never do in writing, but she thanked me for what I'd shared, said it opened the door to a necessary discussion, and that other voices are stepping forward now. That meant lawsuits. That meant reports. That meant the dominoes I'd nudged were still falling somewhere, even if I wasn't around to watch. And that was enough. I wasn't going to be a whistleblower celebrity. There'd be no articles written about what happened, no interviews, no podcasts. Hell, most people at that hospital would probably never know I was the one who started it all. And that was fine. Because some fires don't need explosions, they just need a steady burn. And I'd done my part to light it. I started volunteering at a local clinic, not for money, just for purpose. It was quieter there. No flashing trauma alerts, no executive walkthroughs with polished shoes and empty eyes. Just real people, with real problems, and a staff that still believed in listening more than talking. I liked it. It reminded me why I got into medicine in the first place, before bureaucracy poisoned everything with its metrics and meaningless surveys. Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing at the clock at the top of the hour, waiting for that second nature voice in my head to say med pass or charting due. But the voice was getting quieter with each passing week. My shoulders didn't feel like bricks anymore. My hands weren't shaking from caffeine and adrenaline. And for the first time in years, I wasn't dreading Sunday night like a man waiting on a prison transfer. A few people from the hospital reached out. Elena sent a message thanking me again, said things had shifted after I left, that people were watching each other's backs more now. Travis from ICU sent a picture of his kid in a Halloween costume and wrote, "You did good, man. Just thought you should know." I saved those messages. Not to read every day, but to remind myself that sometimes doing the right thing feels like hell in the moment and only looks like courage in hindsight. I still don't know if I went too far. I think about it sometimes when I can't sleep. I wonder if there was a gentler way, a less dramatic way, a version of events where I could have stayed and changed things from the inside. But then I remember how many times I tried that already, how many times I bit my tongue, let it slide, took the high road only to get run over by the people who'd paved it. So no, I don't regret it. Not the notes. Not the silence. Not the envelope sent without a return address. Because I didn't do it for revenge. I did it so the next nurse who saw a dose that didn't look right wouldn't get mocked for speaking up. I did it so maybe the next patient wouldn't become another quiet statistic in a hallway conversation nobody wanted to finish. Some fires burn quietly. Some victories come without applause. But when you walk away knowing you didn't bend, didn't break, didn't forget who you were even when they tried to bury you, that's more than enough. That's everything.